Hello, I'm taking on a challenge to beat every playable Nintendo published game. Welcome to the next episode. The next game is The Legend of Zelda. Phew, just after last week's Super Mario Bros., we've already got another heavy hitter. Before I dive too much into the game though, I want to first talk about a new attachment Nintendo released in Japan at the same time, the Famicom Disk System. The Famicom Disk System was an add-on for the Famicom in Japan that was created by Uemura and his team at Nintendo R&D 2, the same team responsible for the original Famicom. This attachment allowed for games to be manufactured in a completely new format, writable floppy disks. There are a few reasons why Nintendo wanted to switch to this new format. At the time, these discs were much less expensive than cartridges, so this allowed Nintendo to manufacture and sell games for much cheaper. In turn, the discs could store larger games, and they had extra channels for additional sound capabilities. In addition to these size benefits, the discs were also writable, which allowed for games to save player progress, and it made it possible for games on a disc to be written over entirely with a new one. This later functionality was actually utilized by Nintendo through kiosk services that were placed in many stores in Japan. These kiosks allowed customers to pay a fee to write a new game onto a disc. In a way, this makes me think of a very early version of an online store, where you can pay for the software alone without needing to get a whole new physical disc. However, if you wanted a new disc, they also provided brand new writable discs for an additional fee. By the end of its life, the Famicom Disk System sold over 4 million units in Japan, making it the best-selling console add-on ever made. However, it ultimately didn't meet Nintendo's expectations in the long term, and this is because despite its advantages, it had its fair share of issues. The discs themselves were apparently pretty fragile, and they were much slower to read and write to than a typical cartridge. Another issue was that their writable format made piracy even easier than before, and additionally, third parties were required to share 50% ownership of all FDS games with Nintendo, which caused some companies to ignore the attachment altogether. However, the biggest weakness of the add-on was how quickly the technology became obsolete. In only a few years, advancements in semiconductor technology made cartridges much cheaper than before, and despite Nintendo's initial intention to never make cartridge games on the Famicom again, Nintendo eventually switched back to making cartridge-based games for the system in Japan. Some FDS exclusive games even got ported back to the cartridge format. So, you may be wondering, why did we never see the Famicom Disk System in the West? While Nintendo gave no official reason why the add-on never made it to the US, there are a lot of theories as to why it never happened. The biggest reason I see people claim was that by the time it would have released, cartridges were already starting to become a more viable option. Other possible contributing factors include Nintendo of America's strong anti-piracy strategy, the geographical limitations of trying to make disc-writing kiosks in a country as large as the US, and concerns over consumers not wanting to fork over the added cost of the attachment. Ultimately, it was likely a combination of all of these factors that led to the hardware staying in Japan. An interesting consequence of the FDS never making it to the US was that the NES versions of certain games have some slight alterations due to the differences in hardware. Because of this, I initially considered playing the FDS versions of all the games in the challenge as separate titles from their cartridge releases. However, I ultimately decided to consider these changes as regional variants, since there's often tons of minor changes in games depending on where they were released. If I ever catch up to modern Nintendo games, I might go back and play these variants, but for now, I will just be playing the NES versions if they exist. Hold on though, if saving was possible because of the discs being writable, how did Western NES games like The Legend of Zelda allow for saving? The solution was that Nintendo designed new types of NES carts that included battery-powered storage for holding save data. These carts were more expensive to manufacture though, which is why many companies still decided to stick with passwords during this era. In Japan, the Famicom Disk System launched with mostly ports of their NES games to the new disc format. However, there was also one new title that would help Nintendo push the attachment forward. This title was none other than The Legend of Zelda. Despite being released pretty close to Super Mario Bros., this one was also designed by Nintendo's Rising Stars, Nintendo R&D 4, and the game was once again headed by Nintendo's Golden Triangle, Miyamoto, Tezuka, and Nakako. Apparently, they were developing this title and Super Mario Bros. In parallel, and while Super Mario Bros. Was intended to be a swan song for cartridge games on the Famicom, this one was conversely the big launch title for the Famicom Disk System. Once again, the team gave it their all, and they ended up releasing another smashing success that would have a major impact on the industry as a whole. While it's not really the first game of its kind, the way The Legend of Zelda combined its action elements, puzzle solving, and open-world exploration was like nothing else before it, and it established many conventions that would become a staple for the genre. Miyamoto has said that a lot of his inspiration for the game's sense of discovery stems from him exploring Kyoto and discovering amazing locations as a child. The game's exploration focus and hands-off nature were a pretty stark departure from Super Mario Bros.' overall linear design. Tezuka wrote much of the game's script, and he is apparently a big fan of fantasy novels, which clearly inspired the game's setting. Link himself was inspired by the looks of Peter Pan, as Miyamoto was a big Disney fan and they wanted to make a character whose sprite would stand out. However, the inspiration for the name of Link has a different story. Growing up, I often heard that Link's name was supposed to represent the link between the player and the game. However, I can't find anywhere this has ever been officially stated. Instead, Miyamoto has claimed that the initial inspiration for the name came from the fact that the original Legend of Zelda was going to feature time travel between the past and the future, and Link was the link between the two periods of time. Later on, Miyamoto slightly changed his explanation in Hyrule Historia, saying that Link's name represents how the character connects people together, and that he spreads the scattered energy of the world throughout the ages. Zelda's name, on the other hand, is a bit more clear. Miyamoto has stated that the name was directly inspired by Zelda Fitzgerald, the wife of the novelist F. Scott Fitzgerald. Miyamoto said that he liked the sound of the name and took the liberty of using it as part of the title. The final major character in the game is the primary antagonist, Ganon, the Prince of Darkness. While I can't find any official statements on his inspiration, in early concept designs the character was referred to as Hawkeye, which is likely a reference to Cho Hawkeye, a Japanese name for a pig character from the famous novel Journey to the West. That being said, apart from the fact that they are both pigs, I'm not sure if they took much else from the character, as their personalities are fairly different. These three would become the staple trio of the franchise, and while there are occasional titles that don't include Zelda or Ganon, the central conflict between these three characters would drive the themes of the franchise going forward. So, how does the first game in their series begin? Let's find out. After being treated to a nice title screen, the game's story is told in an opening crawl. Ganon, the Prince of Darkness, has the Triforce of Power, and Zelda, who had the Triforce of Wisdom, split her Triforce into 8 different parts to hide it from Ganon. So, what are these Triforce pieces? Well, the opening doesn't go into any more detail, but there's a bit more information in the manual. Apparently, these Triforce pieces contain mystical powers, but that's all we really know about them. I guess we'll have to wait for a future installment or something to get the full explanation. Anyway, the manual also tells us that Ganon has attacked Zelda's homeland, the Kingdom of Hyrule. She sent her handmaiden, Impa, to find a hero who could defeat Ganon. However, as Impa fled, she was eventually surrounded by Ganon's henchmen, but she was rescued by a young lad named Link. After Impa told Link her story, Link resolved to save Zelda and defeat Ganon. To counter Ganon's Triforce of Power, Link would need to first hunt down all 8 pieces of the Triforce of Wisdom to stand a chance. Now, I've played this one before, so unfortunately, that sense of discovery I mentioned before isn't exactly here anymore. That being said, I often play this game using online maps to clear the dungeons, which I wanted to avoid this time. At the start, you are presented with 3 different paths and a cave. Man, this is already far more open than anything I've played in the challenge so far, and it's only the first screen. Of course, I went in the cave first to get my sword. Here you are greeted by an old man who lets out the iconic line, "It's dangerous to go alone, take this." Alright, with this sword, I'm ready to hunt down some monsters. I wandered around a bit, and I found a shop where I couldn't afford anything. I hunted some monsters to earn some rupees, but I eventually just decided to enter the first dungeon before buying anything. This first dungeon is pretty easy to find. You just cross a bridge over a lake onto an island that contains the dungeon. If you haven't played this one before, the dungeons in this game are basically big mazes with tons of enemies to fight through. There's some puzzles here and there too, such as moving blocks to open doors and keys hidden throughout the various rooms. You can also find a map and compass in each dungeon, which reveal the general structure of the dungeon and where the boss is. All the dungeons are actually shaped like various objects, and this first one is apparently an eagle. Honestly, I always thought it was a magic lamp. In this dungeon, I found a secret room with an old man who gave me a clue. Eastmost Peninsula is the secret. Honestly, I still have no idea what this clue is actually for. The hints in this game can be pretty cryptic, and they're probably even worse due to poor translations. I found a handful of useful items in this dungeon. I got some bombs, which are used all over the place, a boomerang, which could stun enemies, and finally, a bow. Although I unfortunately can't even use the bow until I buy arrows from a shop. Eventually, I found the boss of the dungeon, Aquamentus. This dragon-unicorn hybrid can shoot beams at you, and you have to hit its weak point, its horn, to damage it. Thankfully, I beat it with ease, and it dropped a heart container, which increased my max health, and behind it was one of the pieces of the Triforce of Wisdom. Level 1 complete. Alright, with these bombs, it was time to get some stuff done in the overworld. I bombed a random wall, which contained a moblin who gave me 30 rupees and told me that it was a secret to everybody, whatever that means. With this money, I was able to afford the candle, which can be used to find all kinds of secrets in the overworld. This game has tons of random nooks and crannies to find, and many of them are not obvious. I know some people like just how hard it is to find secrets in this game, but personally, I think it's a bit too much. Bombs are a limited resource, so bombing every remotely suspicious spot just ends up being tedious. Similarly, the candle can only be used once per room, so checking every bush takes a long time too. I'm pretty sure the first time I played this game, I resorted to using a map to find everything, so I already knew where a lot of the good stuff was. The first thing I went for was a hidden cave with a heart container. In these secrets, you can choose to either get a temporary healing item or a permanent life upgrade, and I hope the choice here is obvious. I feel bad for anyone who might have thought the heart just restored a single piece of life and grabbed the potion out of curiosity. I found another one of these secret caves along the southern beach, and I also saved up enough money to buy the arrow. You heard that right, the arrow. You don't actually have to buy a bunch of arrows in this one. Once you get the arrow, you can fire your bow as much as you want. However, each time you fire, it costs you a single rupee. I don't know if you're using the rupees as arrowheads or something, but they probably just did this to reduce the amount of resources they had to store. Up in the north, I found an old man who wanted me to deliver a letter to the old woman, whoever that is. Anyway, while getting a ton of money, I went to a secret shop that contains a valuable item, the blue ring. This thing cost me almost everything I had, but with it, enemy damage gets cut in half. Definitely worth it. I also found the old lady the man was talking about, and delivering the letter opens up a bunch of shops in the world that contain purchasable potions. I couldn't afford any for now, so I'll leave that for later. Alright, with all of these upgrades, it's time to take on dungeon number 2. These shiny new power-ups made the dungeon a total cakewalk. After getting the map, it's revealed that this one is shaped like a crescent moon. Here, the only item you get is an upgrade to the boomerang, which makes it fly further. Kinda lame after all those items I got in the first one, to be honest. There's another old man here with a clue, and this time it's Dodongo dislikes smoke. This is a clue on how to beat the boss, the giant rhinoceros named Dodongo. To beat him, you have to feed him bombs 2 times and he bursts. Pretty easy once you know what to do. With that, I found the second piece of the Triforce of Wisdom, and level 2 was complete. While the boomerang upgrade doesn't open up anything in the overworld, I still had some stuff to do. There was another hidden cave with a heart upgrade, and with 8 total hearts now, I could get an upgrade to my sword. Hidden away in the mountains is an old man that gives you the white sword if you have enough life. This thing is twice as strong as the normal sword, so getting it quickly is a must. I also grinded for enough money to purchase a better shield, and this thing protects you from more types of projectiles. With these upgrades under my belt, it was time to tackle dungeon number 3. This dungeon introduces Dark Nuts, which are a brutal enemy that can't be hit from the front, and there's often a ton of them in a single room. I probably wouldn't call them the worst enemies in the game, but they're up there. In this dungeon, you find the raft, which isn't useful here, but it is necessary to access certain areas in the overworld. Now, at first glance, you might think the shape of this dungeon is, a certain symbol, but it's actually the Manji symbol, which faces the other direction. Also, in this dungeon is an old man who gives a clue about the sword at the top of the map, but I already got it, so I attacked the old man for telling me such a worthless clue. He didn't like this though, and sent beams out at me. The boss of this dungeon is Manhandla, a large man-eating flower. It moves faster with each head you destroy, which can make the fight pretty hectic. I had enough upgrades though that I was largely able to tank my way through the fight, and level 3 was complete. After this dungeon, I bought some meat and one of those potions. The meat doesn't do anything yet, but we'll see its use a little later. Using the raft, I got another heart container, and it also took me to another secret island on the lake with another dungeon. Time for dungeon number 4. In this dungeon, I found the ladder, which is a useful item that lets you cross over single tiles of water. The map of this dungeon looks like a snake, and there's actually a secret room hidden in the eye, despite there being nothing on the map. You have to bomb a secret wall to reveal it, which is pretty tricky. For some reason, Manhandla also makes a return here, despite not even being the boss of the dungeon. The real boss is a multi-headed dragon named Gleeok. As you defeat its heads, they start flying around and attacking you. I entered the boss with barely any health, but thankfully I was able to get through it and level 4 was cleared. Phew, half of the Triforce pieces obtained. After this, I headed straight for dungeon 5. To get there, you have to go up 4 times on a screen that repeats itself. The intended way to figure this out is to use a clue from an old man in dungeon number 4 to find an old woman who tells you the route if you pay her enough. I already knew what to do though, so I didn't even bother talking to her. Time for dungeon number 5. This dungeon contains a strange new enemy called Pole's Voice. These guys take a lot of hits to defeat, although they are weak to arrows. However, their weakness was totally different in the original Japanese version. Instead of being weak to arrows, you could use a microphone built into the second controller of the Famicom to shout at them and defeat them instantly. Also in this dungeon is a room with 3 Dodongos, which is kind of brutal since it requires at least 6 bombs to destroy them, and at this moment I can only hold 8. Not a whole lot of room for error. Thankfully, tucked away in this dungeon is an old man that upgrades your bomb capacity to 12 instead of just 8. Nice. This dungeon is apparently supposed to look like a lizard, but it kinda just looks like someone's head turned to the side. In this dungeon, you get the flute, which lets you teleport from dungeon to dungeon in the overworld. However, it's also required to beat the boss of the dungeon, as hinted at by an old man. This guy is called Dig Dogger, and apparently this thing is a giant sea urchin with a huge eye. Normally, you can't damage it, but once you play the flute, Dig Dogger shrinks and you just have to chase him down and finish him off. With that, Dungeon 5 was complete. After this, I found a secret bracelet hidden in the mountains which lets you warp at a bunch of rocks hidden in the world. Guess this game has 2 different methods of fast travel. After this, I went to a graveyard to find another sword upgrade. This one is the final upgrade, the magical sword, and it requires at least 12 hearts. After getting this, I grabbed another heart container that I forgot to get using the ladder. I also went to a couple of other types of secrets I've intentionally been avoiding just to show them off. One is a money-making game where you risk rupees to hopefully earn more, but I usually don't find it to be worth it. Another type of secret is old men who get mad at you for breaking into their home and they force you to pay for the repairs. You have no real way of knowing if a secret will be a moblin giving you money or an old man taking money away. Brutal. After all this, I decided it was finally time to take on Dungeon 6. This one is pretty easy to find near the graveyard I mentioned before. Man though, I remember this dungeon being so tough for me as a kid. It's covered in a new enemy type, Wizrobes, and the blue Wizrobes in particular are just brutal. It's so hard to hit these guys without also getting hit by their beams, and you have to go through a pretty long stretch in this dungeon with a ton of them laid throughout it. Also, there's another Gleeok here, and this time he has 3 heads instead of just 2. While it ended up being not quite as bad as I remembered it, I still had to use half of my potion to refill my life in this dungeon due to its difficulty. This dungeon makes the shape of a dragon apparently, and in it I found the magic rod that shoots out an attack at enemies. The boss of this dungeon is Goma, a giant spider that can only be hit by shooting it with an arrow when it opens its eye. It ended up dying in a single hit though, which felt pretty anticlimactic. That Gleeok from earlier was more tough. Anyway, with that, Dungeon 6 was complete. I pretty quickly went to Dungeon 7, although this one is a bit more tricky to find. In the previous dungeon, an old man gave the clue there are secrets where fairies don't live, which is a pretty vague one. Typically, when you find a lake in the overworld, you'll find a fairy that refills your life. However, there is one lake without a fairy, and it is at this spot that you need to play your flute, which reveals the next dungeon. Despite being so tricky to find, this one is honestly a bit easier than the last one. That being said, previous bosses do start to show up even more throughout the dungeon here though, as you have to find multiple Dig Doggers again, including one that splits into 3 when you play the flute, and there's a bunch more Dodongos too. There's another bomb upgrade to be found here, and you also get an upgrade to your candle that lets you use it an infinite number of times in a single room. The manual says that the map of this one is just a generic demon, and it is here that we finally see the purpose of the meat. There's a random hungry moblin that will let you past once you feed him. Come on, I've defeated plenty of these guys before. Why is this one so much harder to get past? Anyway, the boss of this dungeon is just the boss of the first dungeon again for some reason, and now that I have all of my upgrades, he was taken down in just 2 hits. What a joke. With that, Dungeon 7 was complete. Level 8 was pretty well hidden. There's a clue way up in the mountains where an old man says, secret is in the tree at the dead end. I guess with the new candle upgrade, they just expected you to start burning down the forest like crazy, as this one is hidden in a pretty inconspicuous location. Burning down a random tree in the forest reveals Dungeon 8, which contains the final Triforce piece. This one is pretty tough. There's a lot of returning bosses and a lot of dark nuts. Thankfully no Wizrobes at least. Here you can find a book that upgrades your wand to turn it into flames once it makes contact with enemies, and the lion key which lets you open up locked doors without needing keys at all anymore. This dungeon is apparently supposed to look like a lion, but I'm not sure I see it. Once again, the boss of this dungeon is one we've seen before. This time it's Gleeok, and he has more heads than ever before, so at least it's harder than the boss of the last dungeon. I tanked my way through it and got the last piece of the Triforce. Nice. Time to take on Ganon. Wait though, where the heck is he? In Dungeon 8, an old man gives you the clue, Spectacle Rock is an entrance to death. Not sure how you're supposed to realize it, but this pair of rocks tucked away in the mountains is apparently Spectacle Rock, and you have the bomb open the entrance on the left. Doing so reveals the final dungeon, and this one is a doozy. This dungeon is massive, and it's full of hard enemies, branching paths, and secret walls. Every time I played this game in the past, I use a map to beeline to all the important locations. However, this time I wanted to full clear the dungeon without using an online map at all. You can't just head straight to Ganon either, as there are some important items to pick up here too. I finally started getting game overs here, which place you at the start of the dungeon. The worst part about these game overs though, is that they start you with only 3 hearts. Ouch. I eventually found the map which reveals the dungeon to be a giant skull. Spooky. After wandering around for a bit, I found the red ring, which doubles my defense once again. This item is super helpful, although it's a bit of a bummer it's hidden so late in the game, but I'll take it. The other item hidden away here was the silver arrows, which are needed to defeat Ganon. Finally, with these 2 upgrades, it was time to face the final boss. This last boss is honestly kind of weird. First, you hold up the Triforce of Wisdom to reveal Ganon himself. However, he immediately turns invisible and starts teleporting around and shooting beams at you. I kind of just started stabbing randomly hoping I would hit him. I got hit a fair amount, but this does work. After enough hits, he turns a brown color, which means it's time to shoot him with the silver arrows. Doing so turns him into ash, and all that remains is the Triforce of Power. I grabbed it and headed to the next room where he was keeping Zelda. You're supposed to slice the flames here to remove them, but I stupidly ran right into them and took damage. I wonder if anyone has ever died here by mistake. Anyway, with this, Zelda was rescued and peace finally is restored to Hyrule. With that, The Legend of Zelda was complete. Well, sort of. You actually unlock a second quest after this, and it's much harder than the first one. While I think beating the first quest is definitely a good enough goal, I decided to do the hard mode too, although this time I decided to use online maps to get through it, since I've already beaten this one before, and some of the dungeons can be pretty rough. I don't want this video to drag on for too long though, so I'm just going to go over the big changes and some of the highlights. While the overworld itself hasn't changed a whole lot, they've shuffled around the locations of a bunch of the dungeons and secrets. Some of these are really obscure too, like this heart container where you have to just randomly play the flute on this screen to make a staircase appear. The nastiest one though is Dungeon 8, which requires you to use a ladder to access a wall you need to bomb. Oh, and the final dungeon is no longer in Spectacle Rock, and it is instead just hidden behind a random bombable wall in the top left corner. The other big change is that the dungeons have been completely redone. The first 5 dungeons are all shaped like letters that are an anagram of Zelda, and while the shape of dungeons 6 through 8 aren't all that interesting, the final dungeon is shaped like Ganon's head now too. Man, some of the changes to these dungeons are brutal. They are swarming with enemies, and they contain a new type of secret that is pretty obscure. You have to press against a wall for a few seconds and Link will pass right through it. I remember being so stuck on this when I first did the second quest. Even with maps, this quest took me longer than the first one. Finally though, after 3 hours on it, I defeated Ganon once again. Peace was truly restored to Hyrule this time, and now The Legend of Zelda was complete. On to the review. Wow, what a far more expansive game than anything I played up until this point. Both this game and Super Mario Bros. Were a huge step up from anything else before it. I really like how open this game is, and hunting through the world and finding upgrades is a lot of fun. That being said, I personally find a lot of the secrets to be a bit too obscure for my tastes. It's not that I don't like well-hidden secrets, on the contrary, I generally like stuff like this. I just think there are better ways to accomplish this that aren't quite so grindy. Additionally, while the combat is serviceable, some rooms can feel a bit too hectic at times, and a few of the bosses just become mash fests. Despite these complaints though, this is still a great first entry title for the series, and I really appreciate the foundation this game laid, as action-adventure games like this are some of my favorites. I really like wandering worlds and finding upgrades, and while I know some people hate getting lost in games, I personally love exploring worlds that have a lot of secrets to uncover. In the end, I gave the game an 8 out of 10. Thanks for watching the video. If you want to see more of these in the future, make sure you subscribe to the channel so that you won't miss out on the next one. Also leave a like if you enjoyed it, since it will help the channel grow and motivate me to continue this series. I hope I will see you in the next step of my quest to beat every Nintendo game.